Today I want to talk about a particular kind of gender theory, one articulated communally from the margins of both writing and feminism. My video will be organized like the journey that my own research was, building concepts and theories before concluding with my own final arguments. In 2010, deep in the bowels of the internet, a new speculative fiction trope was created by fan fiction writers in the supernatural fandom, the vast majority of whom were women. This trope featured characters with two genders, one familiar to us, the man-woman binary, and the other abstractly related to wolf pack hierarchies, the alpha, beta, omega system. Each character has a primary gender, such as man, and a secondary gender, such as omega. These gender combinations are situated in a hierarchical gendered society, usually with alphas at the top and omegas at the bottom. Beyond their place in the gender hierarchy, alphas, betas, and omegas are sexually delineated, with alphas generally being dominant and penetrative, betas being, quote, normal, and omegas being submissive and penetrated. Additionally, both beta women and omegas can become pregnant, even if the omega is cis male. These sexual features are variably biological between different stories. Gender, being the socially constructed meanings given to people labeled as different sexes, is primarily experienced along the alpha-beta-omega axis, rather than the man-woman axis. This means that usually people are privileged or oppressed in ABO stories based on if they are alphas, betas, or omegas. The world of alphas, betas, and omegas, colloquially called Omegaverse, or ABO, is therefore a complexly and doubly gendered world, with a variable mix of biological and structural inequalities and gender relations. Omegaverse's application to our own world is striking, visible as soon as one reads a single Omegaverse story. Alphas are roughly analogous to men, and omegas function as shaky representations of women.
So, is Omegaverse simply an exploration of gender in our world, with different names for men and women?
Well, no. The differences between our world and Omegaverse, both biological and social, change the way gender dynamics work. The differences brought on by the science fiction world building create spaces of meaning between our gendered world and the gendered world of Omegaverse. Let me know after this if you want more about specific examples of meaningful differences between Omegaverse and our world. I'll be happy to provide those. These places of difference, I argue, are conversations fans are having with other fans about the subjective experience of being both gendered by society and the embodiedness of gender. Cultural narratives are literalized and biologized to a certain degree, and the biological differences between omegas and women. The differences reveal the way subjective experiences of gender are literalized and foregrounded in Omegaverse. Conversations like this between regular people and had at the margins work as a kind of folk-level theorizing. Here's my argument. The theories created collectively are about subjective experiences of gender, and therefore serve a kind of social function of allowing expression of subjective and often alienated and lonesome experiences of gender from women that are marginal in various ways. In this way, Omegaverse is very often an emotional and personal theorizing on gender. This project is fundamentally interdisciplinary, as I am simultaneously working with texts and with people. These stories, written by fanfiction authors for other fans, are fundamentally created within a social context, and are clearly responding to social realities of gender in our society. So any analysis of them has to be conjointly one of the text itself, and of the people writing and reading it. My questions are not just, what does this text do? But why are people interested in these stories? I'm therefore using my knowledge of literary analysis from my English studies and my social theories from my anthropology and sociology studies. I'm doing close reading and making an argument of social function. Before I continue, we need to go over definitions. Fan studies is a relatively new and small field, and their objects of study, fanish activity, exists at the margins of popular culture. In other words, not many people outside of the culture of fandom are familiar with its intricate language, developed over decades of insular activity. First of all, and most foundational, is a working definition of fan fiction. For the purposes of my project, I am defining fan fiction as non-commercial writing, usually posted online for the consumption of fan communities, based in some tangible way off of another text, such as a TV show or book series. Fan writers creatively adapt and interpret the source text to tell new stories that exist in intertextual dialogue with both the source text and other fan fiction. Fanfic is the shortened name. The colloquial name for a fan fiction story is a fic, which can also refer to the plural corpus of fan fiction. The majority of fan fiction authors are women, with a plurality being queer/bisexual/pansexual. The most common age range for fanfic writers is 20 to 40 years old. Next, I will quickly give an overview of a fandom term to describe the emotional tone and genre of fic, hurt/comfort. This term will be important when I start to explain the emotional workings of Omegaverse. Hurt comfort is a genre of fic in which a character is put through emotional or physical hurt, which is then followed by the hurt character being comforted and healed by other characters. Fandom is enormous, fanfiction is enormous, and Omegaverse is enormous. To narrow my investigation, I will be focusing on the supernatural fandom, popular fics found on Archive of Our Own, and specifically focusing on the male Omega, which is the most common main character/focal character in ABO fics, so I'm focusing my analysis on them. In the supernatural fandom, the most common Omega character is Omega Dean, so that character is my object of study. Okay, Omegas and women are analogous, but not one-to-one. Fan fiction writers are creating characters that seem to be based on women, but aren't women. Why?
Well, I don't know. That's for you to tell us.
Let's go through some of the reasons that I've come up with. The first potential function for Omegaverse, and the role of male Omegas, is fairly straightforward. Women want to give their favorite characters as many angsty situations as they can think of, and our culture has instilled fears and narratives of vulnerability onto womanhood that to have their character experience a version of it can be fun, hurt comfort. All of the scary parts of being a woman, sexism, rape, fighting our own bodies, make for very dramatic storytelling, if you can stomach it, which might be easier with the distance of science fiction. The comfort part of hurt comfort, if it exists, which in most popular supernatural fics it tends to, serves as a fantasy of comfort for the woman. Through the way their favorite character deals with and heals from gender trauma, the writer and reader, as women, can go through the emotional journey of healing as well. I certainly think that this is partially true, but I want to keep going deeper. Another potential function is the distancing of Omegas from women also allows for some level of emotional removal and ability to manipulate the society in experimental ways that test out thinkings about gender and sex. This is the argument that philosopher of gender Marianne Gunderson puts forward in her master's thesis on the topic. I think that this is a little distant and disconnected from the more organic and emotional reasons people might like Omegaverse. In other words, it's a little too academic. Here's my big theory. Each fic constructs a slightly different pseudo-woman, the Omega, based on their varied use of the tropes of Omegaverse. Taken together, layered on top of each other, These different pseudo-women, the male Omegas, blend together as a palimpsest of social meanings and discourses. A palimpsest is a metaphor that recalls the way ancient texts were continually written over and replaced, but never quite erased, so that the composite text was more complex and deep than any of the individual texts. Fan literature scholar Mafalda Stasi makes the argument that online fanfiction should be interpreted as a palimpsest because it is fundamentally intertextual. Omegaverse fundamentally creates meaning through dialogue with other Omegaverse fics, and together they create composite constructions of the pseudo-woman, the male Omega. To examine the pseudo-woman of the male Omega, let's get to know our example of the male Omega, Dean Winchester from Supernatural. Dean Winchester is one of the main characters in the Supernatural TV show, and spends most of his time shooting monsters, having sex with women, and decrying, quote, chick flick moments of emotional intimacy. He is 6'1", broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, and often has stubble. Yet he is the character that most fans write as the feminized Omega, the penetrated partner and childbearer. He has a pseudo-vagina. Past scholars have argued that fans remove Dean's masculinity when writing him as pregnant, but that hasn't shown in my research. Commonly, Omega Dean maintains his physical stature, as well as his more masculine personality traits, such as gruffness, anger, and emotional constipation. As an Omega, he still wears nothing but flannels and work boots. The result is a character that queers the categories of masculinity and femininity in his mixture of gender presentation and his social position. But the question stands, why do people keep writing Dean as an Omega? What is relatable or interesting about him? Omega Dean is the unfeminine woman. He fits uneasily into the social role of Omegas within Omegaverse, and has often, in fic, internalized that he is a bad Omega for his physicality and his personality. In several of the most popular fics, Omega Dean actively hates his secondary gender, preferring to live as a beta than to be expected to live as an Omega. This character's reaction to a gendered society, I argue, speaks to how women often feel alienated from femininity, and womanhood more broadly, because of the narrow ways they are expected to perform their gender. Omega Dean is the definition of gender liminality, a man, masculine, while simultaneously being a woman and feminine. His uneasiness with his secondary gender, a part that fics often articulate as something separate from his person, such as his inner Omega, is a very clear alienation from the feminine part of himself. Creating and then interpreting Omega Dean is an exercise in self-expression, an externalization and literalization of the subjective experience of being forced into femininity by society, as well as being subject to the oppressions and threats that come with womanhood. Creating and then interpreting Omega Dean is an exercise in self-expression, an externalization and literalization of the subjective experience of being forced into femininity by society, as well as being subject to the oppressions and threats that come with womanhood. As Omega Dean is literally not a woman, he's a man, he further represents the rupture from assigned and socialized gender. Male Omegas function as a mirror of women's experiences of themselves, a way to talk about how it subjectively feels to be a woman, through the distance and safe sandbox of Omegaverse. Omegaverse also allows a fantasy space of healing from gender trauma. Omegaverse is also a creative space for playing with the inner logic of gendered societies. Broadly, Omegaverse is a space where women can talk to each other about how it feels to live in a gendered society, and create a folk-level theory about sex and gender. Thank you.